do you do? What do you do in the bath?
Hello lovelies. Fair warning, this video is likely to run long and there's not going to be a lot of fancy graphics or anything to hold your attention. It's just going to be me talking, and it's going to be me talking about the EU. Now, I am out of patience with Brexiters, especially now that Johnson's led a far-right coup of the UK government, but I am going to try to rein that in and speak to you all as rational adults who are capable of listening to, hearing and processing an argument. You don't have to agree with me, but I'm going to treat you as if you will treat what I say here with respect, and I'm going to treat your concerns and your problems with the EU with respect. Right? I'm also here speaking primarily as a pragmatist, though I will make an idealist pitch at the end of this video to you all about the European Union. Okay? I know people don't like the economic arguments and they don't really cut to the emotional heart of a lot of people's problems with the EU, but they are important and they do reflect a wider issue. Okay? So I'm going to tackle the issues that the non-lunatics bring up to me, because there are some people that just insist that this is the European Union is part of some grand conspiracy of white genocide and start screaming Jew at me in the comments and whatever else. I'm not, and I'm an atheist in any case, so who gives a fuck? But yeah, so I'm going to take the more sane arguments, the rational concerns, and so on. I'm going to try and address them. Now, unlike usual, I've also prepared some notes, not a script, but as usual, I am not going to provide you links and so on. I'm going to encourage you to do your own research, because whatever sources I present to you, you will probably consider to be biased, and, you know, fair enough. But wherever you go for your information, I would probably consider biased. But I've tried to look at both sides, you know, alarmism on both sides, or whitewashing on both sides, and come to a reasonable middle ground. Hopefully that comes across. But yeah, this is going to run long, and it's probably going to be boring, and it's really just for the politics wonks and the Brexiteers amongst you. But all I ask is that you listen to the full arguments, you watch the full video before leaving a comment or screaming Jew at me. Awesome. There's this weird thing with the EU where a lot of people see the thing that they hate the most when they look at it, and yet the thing they hate the most might be contradictory to what someone else sees, and other people see the thing that they like the most in it and ignore the other side. This usually comes out in the idea that the EU is a force for globalism, part of the neoliberal consensus, you know, arch international capitalism, multinational companies and all the rest of it, whereas other people see it as internationalist. So globalism is associated with arch capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, libertarianism, right? And internationalism is associated with the left. It's associated with Marxism and socialism and yeah, other left-wing political ideas. I mean, strictly speaking, the definition of globalism is, you know, free trade, opening up different nations to interact with each other in a capitalist way, with as little interference as possible, at the expense of particular nations or at the exploitation of particular nations. And internationalism is the idea that by cooperating internationally we can better everyone's lot. You know, a rising tide raises all ships sort of thing. Some people get very confused about these terms and talk about globalism as being some sort of international Marxist plot or whatever, and they get the ideas all mixed up. So when Jeremy Corbyn looks at the EU, he might see an exploitative international capitalist thing that is bad for the workers of Britain, right? And when a Tory, like Johnson, though he's probably mostly pretending, looks at the EU, they might see, bureaucracy and socialism and handouts and all sorts of things like that. And there's elements to both of these that are true. I mean, in this video, I don't want to sugarcoat anything. There are problems with the EU. There are problems with the neoliberal consensus. And there are problems also with the ideas of internationalism and so on. Because if you don't have that kind of robust trade and so on, then you can't afford to be generous. You know, society is only as liberal and accepting as it can afford to be. But there is this weird Schrodinger's phenomenon. Now, people's concerns about globalism do tend to be that kind of nationalistic thing. You know, companies are going to outsource, right, wherever they can get the labour cheapest or the materials cheapest or whatever else the case might be, right? So if you work in manufacturing and someone in Romania will do the same job for half the money, you know, it makes business sense for them to do so. Now, that makes it hard for me to understand why a lot of right-wingers who are economically libertarian have an issue with the EU, because surely this is just the market working. And also within the EU, you know, you could move to Romania with all your experience working in that job in Britain, and the cost of living is much lower there, and you would go in at a higher relative wage and so on. You know, why not move abroad and work? One of the great things about the EU is that it has opened up living and working in other countries to people who could otherwise never afford it, right? The rich people have always been able to move around with relative ease because they're rich. Quite often the barriers to doing so are things like paying for the bureaucracy, paying for citizenship exams, meeting a certain threshold to show that you're not going to be a burden on the state. And the EU does away with a lot of that. But Brits don't seem as willing to take up that offered hand. Auf Wiedersehen Pet notwithstanding, which was an old series about British workers who went to work in Germany, right? The other side of this concern is that low-wage workers will come to the UK, you know, migrants, pickers, whatever else. And again, the chief concern is Eastern European people who will come over here, do the seasonal work or whatever, and then fuck off back home or send all their money back home or whatever else the case might be. There's an element of truth to that, but you know, them depressing wages, keeping them low because they're willing to work for so much less. There's an element of truth to that, but it's not really entirely accurate. You have to take the whole. So manufacturing, what you might call traditional industry in the UK, currently only makes up 10% and falling of our economy, of our employment, I think it was. Whereas it used to be 25% around 1980. Now, with all the car manufacturers and so on leaving because of Brexit, you know, that's likely to drop even further with the loss of British Steel, in large part because of Brexit. That's likely to drop even further, but it's part of a long-term trend, and the same thing's happening in the US, that there's been a recent slight upturn. If you look at the graph over time, manufacturing is not coming back. You know, jobs like coal mining and so on aren't coming back unless these right-wing governments that have come in decide to basically bail them out in the same way that the banks were bailed out. That doesn't seem like a particularly good idea to me, and it doesn't seem particularly sustainable. The other thing I think we have to consider is that these wages haven't actually been depressed by that much. Between 1992 and 2017, so all those years combined, it's reckoned that migrants have depressed wages by perhaps 5%. And that's only for the lowest paid, right? Whereas the highest earners in the UK, migration, so this is employers for the most part, migration is reckoned to have increased their income by 3.5%. Yeah, that sounds bad, but you have to set it against the fact that just over that time anyway, other effects have increased the lowest earners' wages by 49% and the highest people's wages by 35%. So yeah, in that context, it's really not that much. It is a real thing, it is a real problem, but the problem itself appears to be low wages and the increasing gap between the rich and poor. And that's a problem that can't be addressed by attacking migrants, right? And if you do stop taking in that migrant labour and so on, then Britain's industry, Britain PLC, becomes less competitive, gets less work, gets less money, gets less revenue, and so on. It's Eastern Europe that really seems to concern people the most, and it's a bit misplaced, but it's not entirely misplaced. People from the main sort of central original members of the EU, when they come to the UK and work, they pay in about £4,000 more than the average UK citizen does. So they're bolstering our pay. Eastern Europeans pay in about £1,000 more. So less, but it's still there. Non-EU migrants, it's either break even, slightly over, or slightly less. So they might be costing us money, but they are not going to be affected by our membership of the EU or not. The crime data isn't particularly clear. There's a concern that migrants raise the crime level, particularly Eastern Europeans, Gypsies, Romanians, all that stereotypical stuff. But the data's mixed. Now, personally, I wouldn't be that surprised if there is an effect on the crime statistics, simply because the fact that crime is correlated with poverty and a lot of people living in bad conditions on low wages, that's where crime is likely going to happen, right? The other aspects to globalism that people are worried about is that the EU somehow acts in accordance with corporate interests and so on. It's hard to see why they would think that would be true, or why they would think that the EU would be particularly vulnerable to that compared to national governments. I mean, the influence that private industry, media industry and so on has over British politics is relatively well known. I mean, just look at the Brexit referendum and the interference and the illegality by Aaron Banks and others. You can already see that the corruption is there. The EU, however, is bigger, harder to corrupt in such a way. You would have to buy a lot more politicians, and it has a record of doing pretty good things against corporate overreach. Antitrust legislation, threatening to break up Google, bringing Amazon under scrutiny, bringing Facebook under scrutiny, and plenty of other companies. Margareta Vestager was well known for this. You can look her up. 2018. She's the one that makes companies tremble. And this idea that we can somehow be a global Britain outside of Europe is frankly delusional. Right? The EU has recently made a lot more trade deals. The one with Canada, the one with Japan, and so on. Things that we're going to be missing out on, right? And the EU has a lot more clout in these trade negotiations because it's bigger, because there's so much more money in play. Now, if we set out after leaving the EU to make these kind of deals, we're going to have a hard time of it. We're not going to get deals on the same kind of grounds. We're not going to be able to exert the same amount of leverage. We can be more specialist about what we want from these deals, but overall, we're not going to get deals that are as good, and we're not going to get them quickly for a variety of reasons. So just to make up the ground that we're losing is likely going to take decades, and we're missing out on these new deals. People are talking up very much about deals with America, and I think it's already obvious how weak our negotiating position with America is, particularly if it's still Trump in office in a couple of years' time. You know, he's unlikely to respect the special relationship. He likes our pomp and circumstance and all of that kind of side of Britain, but he's a ruthless businessman, if he is genuinely that, and he's likely to seek to exploit us, because that's what businessmen do. Right? And we've already seen how one-sided that relationship is with recent events in Iran. America, under Trump, expect Britain to back them up, to defend their tankers and hunt down whoever attacked them, but doesn't reciprocate and refuses to aid us in tracking and protecting our tankers. So you can already see the problem, and the pressure to accept much lower quality American food imports, classically chlorinated chicken, laxer American food standards. They've got their eyes on the NHS, you know, and it goes on and on and on. And we're going to be in such a weak position, we don't have a lot to negotiate with. Jeremy Hunt, somewhat famously, well, yeah, he was running for leadership of the Tory party as well, but he floated the idea of turning Britain into Singapore on the Thames, if you will. It's not really viable, and even then, if you look at Singapore, it might be wealthy, but it has a host of social problems, social issues. It's essentially a dictatorship. It's a corporatist state, and the departing commissioner to Singapore, what was his name? Scott Whiteman, I think. At the time Jeremy Hunt was floating this idea, said the people in Singapore don't understand Brexit, why you're doing it, why you're doing this amount of self-harm, and don't think that Britain can follow the model, and neither do economic analysts. So that would require, even if we tried to pursue it, you know, becoming a tax haven, which means the poorest are going to suffer just like they always do, and business is going to get more say. So if you're concerned about corporatism, if you're concerned about the dark side, the negative side of globalism, that can only get worse if we're not part of the EU. We will be less able to enforce our laws over the companies. We will have less clout with the companies. We will have less clout in negotiations, and it will take us a long time to even partially make up the lost ground. Now, a big part of the migration issue we've already covered. You know, migrants pay in more to our society than they take out, and that's even Eastern European migrants and arguably non-EU migrants. But here we're kind of concentrating on the EU. But that doesn't stop people being concerned about migration, though their concerns appear to primarily be with non-EU migrants from Africa, on a more racist basis, sub-Saharan Africa, or from the Middle East, and so on. And so they're worried about the culture clash and so on there. I mean, we share so much culture with Europe that it seems absurd to be concerned about that. You know, the Brits are a mongrel race of anyone. We should share, you know, cultural indicators with people from across the continent. But kind of by the by, I'll come back to that at the end. But the big thing about migration that seems to worry people is Islamic migration. Yeah, like I said, non-EU migrants. And the big concern appears to be that once someone has entered the EU, that they can then come here. So if a European nation like Germany accepts a whole bunch of Syrian refugees, then people over here are concerned that they will then come here. You know, and to be fair, a lot of illegal immigrants or asylum seekers do try to come to the UK for some reason. It's not the climate. I don't know what it is. Okay, fair enough then. This isn't really an EU issue, but we should probably still try and tackle it, right? I mean, as we've covered, EU migrants pay in more than they take out. When it comes to non-EU migrants, when it comes to Islamic migrants, And I do think you're probably being a little bit racist. Islam isn't a race, but people on both the extremes of the left and the extremes of the right tend to conflate the two. What they're really referring to is people from a different culture, a genuinely misogynistic culture, a genuinely fundamentalist culture, which is kind of very much at odds with the British character. Though once you get a couple of generations in, it does tend to soften, and people do tend to become westernized. There's all kinds of things that people are worried about that don't make sense, like being outbred or a white genocide. So I want to steer clear of the conspiracy theory nonsense, at least in this video, and tackle it more kind of head on. Which sounds weird because I've just spent all this opening section kind of beating around the bush, I guess. Okay, so you're concerned about non-EU cultural people coming into the EU and then using the freedom of movement within the EU to come here and settle, and this is bad somehow. Well, the EU spreads out immigration over a broad area. You can already veto or opt out, or at least the UK can, from taking anyone on. It's a bit more controversial in places like Hungary and so on, if they're refusing to take them on or not doing their share of taking the load. But you know, these are human beings having a hard time. We need workers. We're barely replacing our populations anymore. Some of them are in slight decline and so on. The globe is likely to cap out its population fairly soon, which is actually good news because, well, amongst other things, it means everyone's been raised up to a more kind of sustainable, comfortable existence and don't need lots of babies because not so many of them are dying and people have retirement plans now. It's just... It's hard to know how to address this because it's all based on a misunderstanding. You can't travel around freely in the EU if you're a migrant that comes to the EU unless you get citizenship or a permanent EC sort of leave to remain. So let's take Germany as an example, right? Because they've taken on the most migrants, and it seems to be migrants from there that worry people the most. You know, they come through to France and then over to here. Well, even as part of the EU, we have the right to refuse anyone with a criminal record or, you know, other issues to do background checks, whatever. We can refuse migrants that the EU as a whole decides to take on. We have a personal veto on that. But in order to be able to come here legally as part of the EU, for this to be an EU concern, they need to be EU citizens or to have, you know, permanent leave of stay in the EU. To get that, in Germany, you have to have been living there for 5 uninterrupted years. You have to have a secure livelihood with health insurance, provision for your retirement. You have to have adequate living space. I think it's like 10 to 15 square meters per person, right? You have to know German adequately to be able to pass conversationally. You need to have a basic knowledge of German life, not quite as big as the citizenship test. You have to understand their legal systems, their social systems, and so on, and you have to not be a criminal, right? And once you've jumped through all those hoops, if you then want to move around Europe, you can. So we're not going to be flooded, save by illegal immigrants, which we can deal with as we wish. If you're worried about criminals or whatever coming over here, we have a right to refuse them entry, even if they're EU citizens, in fact. So what are you worried about? Right? We do take on non-EU immigrants, and the irony of all this is that post-Brexit we're going to have to take more of them, and they're the ones that contribute less to our society. So I'm waffling because the argument makes no real sense whatsoever. The cost. of the EU concerns people, and the potential for corruption and bureaucracy and all the rest of it. I'm sympathetic to a lot of these arguments, and I think outside the British context, I would be more sympathetic to a lot of these arguments. We have a rebate. We pay in about 13.8 billion. We get about 4 billion back. So overall, we pay in about 9 billion per year. Something like that. That's about £123 per person per year to have membership of the EU. And a lot of that money that comes back to us comes back in the form of investment in some of the worst off areas and so on. Kind of things that our local government, our national government should be doing, but isn't really. So a lot of these places that voted leave are in for a short, sharp shock once the EU funding dries up, which is why so many MPs and local councils and so on are scrambling to get promises from government that they will continue to support these EU initiatives. They will spend the same amount of money moving forward. I think that's rather unlikely, and things are going to get a lot harder and harsher for people, ironically, in primarily pro-leave communities. So, okay, it costs us about £123 each per person per year to be members of the EU. But what do we get back for that? Well, you get the right to live, love and work anywhere in the EU. For some reason, Brits don't avail themselves of this opportunity as much, right? I don't know why. The language thing? I don't know. Most people in Europe have English as a second language. We're terrible at languages, which is probably why. People in these other nations are willing to uproot themselves, at least temporarily, and come to the UK for work. Brits seem less likely to do that, to have the graft, to be away from their families for that long, whereas people in other countries seem less reticent to do so. That doesn't seem to me to be a problem with the EU. It's extending the opportunity to us. We're just choosing collectively not to take it up. The efficiency issue, the remoteness issue, I'm sympathetic to these. I think decisions should be taken as locally as possible, as much as possible. But there is an undeniable economy of scale once you bring together lots of money, and it opens up other possibilities, other projects, a scale of project, a scale of development that we can't do individually or as individual nations, right? Things like CERN and everything that's come out of that require huge amounts of international cooperation, international spending. Space programs are increasingly organised in this way if they're not going private. All of this stuff. So that there are good positive sides towards collectivization, if you will, towards scale, right? So bigger institutions with more money and more power are capable of doing more efficiently and more cheaply, if not necessarily as quickly or as agilely. But you need a combination of both to have a broad, comprehensive, effective economy, right? And to allow for development and R&D and all the rest of it. So, yeah, there's good and bad sides to that. The EU is a powerful trade negotiator on our behalf, on everyone's behalf in Europe, and has got better deals for us collectively as a whole than we otherwise would have been able to get. There's an ease to buying and selling across Europe, to shipping across Europe. There's all this just-in-time shipping that brings down prices and makes more food and other things more available more cheaply. It's very hard to quantify and put an actual hard number onto what EU membership is worth, but people have tried. There's a whole bunch of estimates. That I say it's hard to pin down. The absolute base lowest estimate of what EU membership is worth to us that I could find was something like £30 billion a year. The highest estimate was 120 billion. But even if we take just that that 30 billion, right, we could be paying in 3 times as much to the EU, and it would still be worth it to be a member, financially speaking, as a nation, collectively, right? Possibly much, much more. So just economically, there's that. And then socially and otherwise, there's all these other benefits. Like, say, live, love and work across the continent. And we do live in an increasingly global world. Globalist or internationalist, you know, this is undeniable. We make all these kinds of connections and friendships and romances and whatever else across the world. National boundaries mean less and less. You might consider that to be a bad thing. But if someone from Bath falls in love with someone from, I don't know, Poland, why shouldn't they be allowed to be together? Why should we put up so many barriers in the way of that? Yeah, that's kind of personal, emotive argument, but this is happening on such a grander scale. Yeah, and we benefit so much from this membership, and that gives us money which we could, if we so chose, use to regenerate our areas, to retrain people, to make life better. And that's an issue I'm going to revisit at the end. One of the biggest concerns that people express is the supposed lack of democracy in the EU, in its institutions. Yeah, as a student of history and of politics, I find this rather laughable, but I guess I can understand why people think that's the way that it is. The EU seems remote. We don't follow it with the same passion and interest and understanding that we do our national politics. EU politics only tends to make the headlines when something goes wrong, right? Otherwise you don't tend to hear about it unless it's some complete bollocks story in the Express or the Mail about bananas or whatever else the case might be. Yeah, that's really the only time you hear about it. We don't follow the deliberations for the most part. Unless you're a real politics wonk, you don't watch the proceedings of the European Parliament or even pay attention to who is in charge. You know, even in the febrile atmosphere of Brexit, the EU elections, and there's a clue as to how on how democratic it actually is. You know, barely had any following. Turnout still wasn't great, even though you'd think people would be impassioned about it. What can you do? The democracy's there. People choose not to participate. Do we respect that right or not? It always seems laughable to me because in comparison to the UK, the EU is a bastion of democracy, right? But at the same time, I recognise that there is a democratic deficit in the EU. It's just that the UK is worse. If you lived in Denmark or something and you were complaining that the EU was undemocratic, I would think you would have a point, much more of a point, you know, or Finland or somewhere Nordic where they really focus on their democracy from the ground up. But we live in a constitutional monarchy where people are even talking about getting the Queen to intervene to stop a no-deal Brexit. We just had Boris take over as Prime Minister without a proper election. There's unlikely to be one, and this despite the Tories complaining when Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair without a general election. And he has replaced almost the entire cabinet, which also isn't selected democratically, with hard right headbangers, swivel-eyed, hard Brexit loons. Right? Sorry, but they are, and some of them have some really dodgy and corrupt backgrounds. Our new Home Secretary was fired from their previous job for kind of making under-the-table deals with people. Right? This is a problem. This is an issue. We should have a general election in any sane world. We should have had one when Brown took over in any sane world. And yet the same people who are clamouring for democracy and that democracy should be respected when it comes to the EU don't seem to give two tugs of a dead dog's cock about Boris just waltzing in and taking a hardline tiny minority position and imposing it on the whole country without a democratic test. There's something weird about that, isn't there? Now, a lot of the EU isn't directly democratic, but the EU Parliament is, and the EU Parliament is one of the checks and balances in the whole institution, right? It has right of refusal, right of oversight, it can make amendments, and so on. So it's a lot like our own Parliament in a lot of ways. It doesn't quite have the same amount of power, but the direction of travel has been for the EU Parliament, the directly elected part, to have more say. If you're worried about someone who's been elected in Spain having a say over what happens in the UK, why aren't you concerned that someone in Scunthorpe has a say over what policies get implemented in Bristol? It's the same argument, it just doesn't make sense. You know, we're talking on an EU scale. You get to influence what happens to the guy in Spain just as much as the guy in Spain gets to influence what happens with you. Well, less so, because we've got vetoes and national interest and so on, and various ways that we can block or shift or change that. And in any case, the British government has agreed with, I believe, over 90% of EU policies. So that complaint doesn't particularly seem to make sense. The Commission is appointed, but it is appointed by the elected national governments, and the directly elected Parliament can reject them. People say that the Parliament cannot propose legislation in the same way that our Parliament can. You know, we have backbencher bills and so on. Well, technically that's true, but in all member states, I think it's 85% of bills that aren't introduced by the executive, you know, the cabinet, the actual government, fail anyway. And the EU Parliament can propose legislation, it just has to be taken up by the Commission, which is the executive of the EU, and they have to present it as a bill. So the Parliament can propose legislation, and via amendments and so on it can pretty much create legislation. People are worried that Parliament doesn't have enough oversight in the EU. There are various bodges and workarounds and so on that have been made, and there are proposals for more powers for Parliament and to make it, the whole EU as a whole, much more democratically accountable, primarily via empowering the Parliament. But there are bodges and workarounds, like if Parliament rejects something but doesn't have the legal power to do so, various EU governments with veto powers have pledged that they will veto anything that the Parliament votes against. I think Italy, Belgium, can't remember who else, but they've promised to do that. And as I say, the general direction of power has been towards the democratisation of the EU and more power for the directly elected democratic body. This came to a head under Santer's presidency. I think he was a president. There's several presidents. It does get confusing, which is a complaint I thoroughly uphold. So when it comes to democracy, if you compare it to some democracies, the EU does have a democratic deficit. It's not as democratic as I would want it to be, but I am heartened by the fact that each step of the way, the last one being 2009 with the Lisbon Treaty, it has been more and more democratised, and more power and influence has been invested in the European Parliament, and that various nations who have been concerned about a democratic deficit that they perceive being in the EU have figured workarounds, bodges, which are likely to later be, you know, enshrined in statute. So the argument coming from the UK that we don't regard it as democratic is absurd, especially when we're trying to enforce what is now very much a minority opinion on Brexit. A hard Brexit, a no-deal Brexit. It wasn't on the cards. Nobody voted for that at all. No matter what anyone tells you, it's not true. It wasn't ever suggested during the campaign. And a hard Brexit is very much a minority position. I think the most recent poll, as I come to make this video, is something like 51% Remain, 44% still want to leave regardless, 4% haven't made up their minds, but it has fairly consistently been pro-Remain by the margin of error, for more than the margin of error, for some time now, as it sinks in how terrible and awful an idea this actually is. So there's a democratic deficit here. We're still seeking to enforce the most extreme form of something that was only narrowly won through corruption and shenanigans 3 years ago. That's not very democratic. The Remain campaign was rightly criticised for concentrating on, fixating on dry economic arguments, and I understand and I accept that to an extent that's been what I've presented in the video thus far, but the thing is, primarily, I think after decades of bullshit from the Murdoch press, after a nasty, vicious, lying, corrupt campaign by the Leave campaign during the referendum, a certain amount of debunking is necessary, and a certain amount of more detached examination of the economic factors is important. I don't think the EU is really either a globalist or an internationalist thing, right? It has consistently acted in the interest of European citizens. It has negotiated trade deals that are far more effective than anything we could figure out alone. It's stood against corporations, its antitrust and so on. Legislation is all pretty powerful, and they've been fairly strong in enforcing that. It's worth so much more than we pay in, even taking the lowball estimates, right? At least twice what we pay in. The migrant issue isn't really an issue if we chose to enforce the laws that are already in place. And if you're concerned about non-EU migration, if you're concerned about Islamic immigration and so on, it's got nothing to do with the EU. Virtually nothing to do with the EU. There's already barriers in place there. And these communities and so on that you have such an issue with, they're migrating directly to Britain, for the most part. Or we're taking on a certain amount of refugees, for the most part, over which we have total control. So to blame the EU is just wrong-headed. And if you're concerned about non-EU migration from these places, that is going to have to increase post-Brexit, not decrease, because we're still going to have to make up that ground somehow. And we don't have a lot of options if we're outside of the EU. It's just not a thing. Yeah, and there's all these opportunities and there's all this value associated with the EU, but we as a nation don't seem to be taking it up. But that's just kind of recapping everything that I've said before. What's the positive argument that I can make for the EU? It's open. It allows us, like they say, to live, love and work anywhere on this continent, and it makes it easier to go further afield, and it gives us a degree of soft and hard power to rival the US or China or the emerging dangers around the world. You know, militarily, economically, and so on. We're better in than out, and it's not just that's so good and interesting about it. It gives us a more collective identity, something beyond the bounds of petty nationalism and all the problems that go with that as Europeans. And in some ways you'd think the far right would be in favour of that, because they're always talking about Western civilization and European civilization and so on. And here we are trying to form a European civilization, and yet somehow they're against it. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I think it's a grand example of the best of Europe, you know, coming out from World War I, World War II, saying, right, never again. Let's form structures, let's cooperate with each other so that this never has to happen again. And it's been massively successful, economically, socially, politically, in all of these ways. It allows us to spread the pain and spread the wealth. It's provided regeneration to areas of our own country that we've neglected. You know, Britain has some of the wealthiest and the poorest in the top 10 of both in Europe, which just illustrates this huge gap in our society, and the EU can help close that. Britain has always been a mongrel nation, mixed up. You've got Celts, you've got the Danelaw, the Normans were French Viking, you have the Angles, the Saxons, we're part Germanic, part French, part Scandinavian, part Celtic. We've got a bit of everything. The Romani have been over here for God knows how long, and they're reckoned to have come from India originally. They're a part of us as well. The Windrush generation has integrated. The Indian community, the Hindu community that fled persecution in South Africa to come to us has integrated. A lot of the Pakistanis who came here have integrated. Of all the imperialist nations, we have been the most successful at facing up to, dealing with our past, not having been quite as awful as some of the others, maintaining reasonably good relations via the Commonwealth. We, as a mongrel nation, as an internationalist nation, are perhaps best situated of all the parts of Europe to make it a success, and to make a success of it for us, if we choose to. We reinvented ourselves after Empire, after the Suez Crisis, when we realised that we were no longer a big global player, that we couldn't compete with the US or the Soviet Union in that era. We let it go. We let it go, and we became a soft diplomatic power, a powerful banking nation, a trading nation. We reinvented ourselves in that way as diplomats, as traders, though we'd always been that. Now we face another crisis. We still think, we're still hostages to our nostalgia about Britain standing proud in the war against the Hun and all the rest of it. We need to be taught humility again, and we need to reinvent ourselves again as leaders in Europe, remain and reform. If we find it undemocratic, push for reform. There is a mood in Europe now for democratic reform. We could get those changes. Make it work for us, make it work for everybody. And what we've done, what has led us to this point, is blaming Europe for our own problems. We have chosen not to implement the immigration rules that we could do, for valid reasons, but not reasons that we've made arguments for. Instead, we've blamed other people, other countries, Europe, as if we were somehow separate from it. Government after government after government, and the Murdoch press and everything else has just bullshitted us. Europe isn't perfect, but it could be a lot more perfect if we really threw ourselves into it, made a success of it, tried to improve it. People say, are you going to push hard to make a success of Brexit? We never pushed hard to make a success of Europe. Did you try when we were members? Well, we still are. But will you try to make a success of it if we remain? Will you push for reform if we remain? That's where it is. I see this as a stepping stone to a true global human consciousness. An understanding that we are all one people, we share a world, we share concerns, we share problems, and that if we make things better for our neighbour, we also make things better for ourselves. We seem to have a really hard time processing that in all the Anglo-Saxon nations, that if everyone benefits, I benefit, Enlightened self-interest. And it is in our enlightened self-interest to be in Europe and to make a success of it and to reinvent ourselves as Europeans. So I guess that's my pitch. Do you want to make a better world? Do you want to make a closer world? Do you want your children to be better off, more stable, more secure than you are? Because that future is to be found in Europe and this growing global consciousness. It's not to be found in closed borders and petty nationalism, racism, and blaming others for our own choices and mistakes. Zang.